This collection of my drawings over the past retirement years are of buildings and properties restored or replaced that I have had some personal memories of in this Leonardtown of mine. My friend Pat Hunt, Abel Guy, lived here, which is north of the Front Porch Restaurant, which now was the old Sterling House. About 50 years ago, a sailor driving too fast crashed into the house just after Ed Stokel's father and mother had gone upstairs to bed. When the fire department arrived to call of the accident, they could not find the car as it was in the middle of the living room. My friend Pat Hunt, Abel Guy, lived here in the 40s, which is north of the Front Porch Restaurant, which was the Sterling House. But about 50 years ago, a sailor driving too fast crashed into the house just after Ed Stokel's father and mother, living there then, had gone upstairs. When the fire department got a call of the crash, they went up to the corner and couldn't locate the car until they found it in the middle of the living room. This drawing is east of the North Park of Leonardtown, but starting with the St. Paul's Church. The next building was the parsonage, of which a Reverend Naylor was there in the 40s and lived in that parsonage. And Chip Wood lived in what we called then the Swayback Manor, an old home there, next to the Harry Jones store, which was where the Bank of America is now. Dick Gibson had a barber shop there. This is back in the late 30s and 40s in Leonardtown. Fenwick Street looking north with the Harry Jones store on the left, where Charles and Laverne Fenwick lived on the second floor. Their children, Budgie and Elmer, played in this area. The little fish house there was across from Duke's Bar at the time. Richard Edwards lived in the first section of the large duplex building on the right, and Mr. Johnston had his grocery store on the right part of that building. That same building has been removed back about 100 feet and is still there. But most importantly here, the back behind this was where we in the winter had some great sleigh riding hills. You might see a little sleigh rider there on top of the hill. And yet back over the hills, from my bird's eye view, you could see St. Mary's Academy, old school and building. Looking south on Fenwick Street, west of Duke's Building, about 1940, Stanton Guy was going to sell Chevrolet cars, but Bell Motor Company had closed their operation at Cedar Point because of the Patuxent River Naval Air Station moving in. And Walter Wise told me that this was a Texaco gas station. Elmer Jarbo was an employee there, greasing cars and so on. You could also see the St. Mary's Hotel in the background, the First National Bank, and the Bank Franklin store, which Abel Longmore Sr. had started out at 5 and 10. Going east down Fenwick Street, Booker Mattingly's house on the far left and home, and then O'Berry's Bakery. This was in 1940. Richard Edwards had moved in across from this building and remembers that it was a bakery there. Tommy Mattingly's father, Teeny, had worked there, and we were all trying to find a location for this little donut shop. Now, next to that is the building that Richardson built, and far corner of that, the post office was in that far corner of the right. The Keys owned the building way back out back, which is the Tudor Hall, now the St. Mary's County Historical Society building. This advertisement of the O'Berry's Bakery was furnished by Frankie Tippett, as several of us in town were trying to get the history of this bakery that none of us really remembered too much about. The William C. Mattingly Funeral Home was located on Fenwick Street, looking north on the corner of Lawrence Avenue. The Mattingly name did not have an E at that time, but the age of this is in the early 30s, and they then had a horse-drawn funeral hearse that was a large window in it and a horse peeking out of the barn there where the horses were kept and stored. The little small building there was a metal building the Leonardtown Volunteer Fire Department owned, but had been moved there from across the street. In earlier years, they remodeled that building by constructing a brick building with 3 bays for the fire department, and that building is now being used as the Knights of Columbus. That's across from Pope Street on the right, and you can see the old St. Aloysius Church on the right and the Leonardtown Water Tower there in the center. This building was across the Fenwick Street corner of Pope Street, just across from the now Knights of Columbus building. Mr. Java was quite a repairman and good at refurnishing furniture, upholstery, repairing buggy wheels. And this was Frankie Tippett's great grandfather. And he also told me that he repaired violins. Quite a unique gentleman. This was on the corner, as you can see, the Mattingly Funeral Home to the right, back, and the horse barns there to the right. But this was on Pope Street. And I joined the fire department in 1944, and in 1945, the first carnival after the war was held down in the center of Leonardtown in the North Park and the portion of Route 5 going north on the right side. The complete area was blocked off at night, and the road of the left side was up and down, north and south, with controlling the traffic, as the St. Paul's Church down in the right-hand corner would help you identify the location, and some of the old homes in Leonardtown to the top from left as Dr. F. Greenwell's home, where the Blair building was, and down next was Dr. Hayden's dentist, and then Mrs. Morgan had a home there, which is down the post office. Next was Mr. Wise that worked at the little bank in town, and eventually got down to the small old-time library in Leonardtown, and the final house was Mr. Enoch Abell's house, all along Washington Street Road. This is a lower section of Washington Street, and the little bank on the right first was the County Trust Company, which I started working in 1947. The building is still there, but next to it when I went there was the Rose Cottage, very old, pleasant home that was very popular with the people in town years ago. And the next building, a large building, Dr. Harris Camely, a dentist, had his office in the right. But that building on the back end, the Enterprise was printed there, and that building was moved there for the construction, but it's located at where the First National Bank building is now. And before that building was built, that was its location, called the St. Mary's Reading and Writing Society. And they had to remove the building, so it was Mr. Enoch Abell, frankly, moved that building and attached it to that building, as he and Mr. Holmes were the editors and printers of the Enterprise. At the top of the town hill going south, Washington Street, the Wilmer House was located between the Camely home on the left and the building I just explained there where Dr. Camely was as a dentist. But the Wilmer home, a Norma Jean Rogers' father was a state trooper there, and they lived there. And Norma was my age and in our class growing up in Leonardtown, and she married Fran Harris that had the roost in Lexington Park. The home on the left, the Cavaliers owned, and Anne Cavalier and my wife Anne were close friends in Leonardtown. The ice plant was located across from the Leonardtown Wharf Club building, and in 1949, the Ladies Auxiliary had a dance at the dance hall, and Beach Clark and I myself were asked to sell tickets. And at about 10:30 that night, an explosion and a bright light appeared outside, and as we came out the door, the whole area was just like daylight, as the power plant and the wiring and connection to the location of the ice plant, they had shorted out, and the jacks that close in had dropped open, and it was burning somewhat like an arc weld. Beach mentioned to me, don't look at this because it could harm your eyes. Fire department was called, and they really couldn't do anything. And finally, the Southern Maryland Electric sent 4 persons over to make the correction, and as they did, they had some time of being to have to look at the light or see the light, and so on. Later, after this settlement of that night, I woke up the next morning not able to see. I couldn't see it. My mom and dad said, we'll see what Dr. Camely has to say. And later, Mr. Barnett Smith came in the door and said, I've understood Kennedy can't see this morning, and it's because of the arc light last night. It's like an arc weld, and I have some ointment I will put on his eyes, as that is what we can do to help him relieve the burning. As he did this, he said, I'm going to the other persons who also blinded like you, such as Beach Clark, Dickie Duke, and the 4 Southern Maryland Electric employees. So through this session, he went to each one's house and admitted this ointment, but would not leave the tube because he was afraid they might overuse it. And on the 3rd day, they all came to my house at the hotel, St. Mary's, where I was living at the time, and wanted to tell me, you'll be able to see as we now can. And after the 3rd day, I regained my eyesight. This was an exciting time for me, and I'll never forget it. Redhead Frank Coombs, who had managed and ran the North End gas station, built this building prior to 1949, but in doing so, it's out over the water and directly across from the ice plant. This building I had sketched with a ballpoint in my early doing. Most of my drawings were pencil, But the fact of this building being located down here, it also had a short life, as later on Ed Bailey and wife Patsy were going to take over this, buy this, and set up their operation of restaurant and management, and everybody was very excited as it was on the water. Many boaters could come in and enjoy the festivities. And as they were preparing to get ready for this, it caught on fire one night. The fire department got called. I was on the fire department to respond to a call that was at Loveville. And I came out of the house of seeing the fact that the bright light was down in Leonardtown. The further I went, it was over the hill. And there it was, the entire building was completely involved in flame. Almost looked like an ice cream cone. Very sadly, this building was destroyed by fire, and the Baileys had invested somewhat a large sum of money remodeling and fixing up the building, but it was a sad, sad time for them. Al Goff grew up here on Jefferson Street, the north end of Leonardtown, which is located about where the county nursing home is now. And the old wooden hospital was off to the right, which was at somewhat the end of Lawrence Avenue. If you think of the street coming up from Lawrence Avenue, you could have driven across the street and go right on into the hospital. But on Jefferson Street, Route 5 there now, to the left was Webb Bell's home, off on the left, and he and Ernie and Al grew up together there as friends. The home of Webb Bell was named Town End, as Ernie said. His mom said, well, we're at the end of town, so we'll call it Town End. On the right, there was a racetrack out further on the Route 245 going to Hollywood. As you may have heard, that the farm out there is called Racetrack Farm, which starts about Bessie Lane and goes out to what they call Milepost Road or Drive. That was about the area which all of the racetrack was in, and I might have located the track circle a little more to the left. It should have been further out to the right. But the area there was called Tartown because when they had that area, they had taken wooden slabs which were cut off the boards, like when you're making a tree and you cut the end off it and you can't use it, it's a slab, and they would stand these slabs up as a fence-like so people couldn't see the races. But then there were so many openings, they had to come back with some tar and close up the areas through that fence line. And Mr. Charles Fenwick told me they called it Tartown because of the tarring those openings to that fence so you couldn't watch the races. This is all history, and I have enjoyed doing this. When the new elementary school was dedicated, I sketched this drawing the day before and gave a copy to Al Goff and Ernie Bell for their effort in support of my submitting the Captain Walter Francis Duke name to be considered for this school. Over the several years that we had to meet and propose programs and have the family's support to get the Board of Education to agree to naming the school Captain Walter Francis Duke. Of course, he did fly the P-38 airplane, and his family Duke cemetery plot is within 500 yards north in the old church cemetery. And Al Goff had done a little story about the World War II hero, and my thoughts were hopefully someday his remains will come home and settle there, and we'd all be very proud of him in Leonardtown, as we have been.